Hello, my lovely friends. It's Emma here from Just a Girl Who Loves Elvis. So today I wanted to talk about two different versions of Elvis. The one the world thinks it knows, and the one that actually existed. Because when someone becomes famous, people stop seeing them as layered. They stop being allowed to be complicated, gentle, unsure, contradictory, or just human. They become a story, an image, a character. And I don't think that's fair. So on Wednesdays, this is what we're going to do. We're going to step behind the image and look at the person. Not dramatically, not emotionally, not romantically, but honestly. And today, I want to start with one of the biggest misunderstandings about Elvis. People thought he was confident. But I think what he really was sensitive. And those two things are not the same. For most of the world, Elvis Presley was confident. Not just confidence, but certainty. The kind of certainty that walks into a room and feels it. The kind that doesn't seem to doubt itself. The kind that looks like it knows exactly who it is. People saw him on stage and thought, well, that must be who he is all the time. Strong, bold, unshakable, untouchable. But here's the thing. Performance confidence and personal confidence are not the same thing. And I think that's where a lot of misunderstanding began. Now, I don't think Elvis was unconfident. But I don't think he was emotionally armoured either. I think he was sensitive. And I mean that in the truest sense of the word. Not fragile, not weak, not dramatic, just receptive. Sensitive people don't skim life. They absorb it. They notice small shifts. They pick up on tone. They feel atmospheres. They carry other people's moods. And that kind of wiring can look like confidence on the outside, but feel very different on the inside. Because when you feel things deeply, the world can feel very loud. I think part of why people misunderstood Elvis is because we don't really have a good cultural understanding of sensitivity. We often confuse it with being fragile, with being weak, or being emotionally unstable. But I think sensitivity is actually about awareness. It's about taking things in. And when someone is famous, that awareness can become overwhelming very quickly. Because suddenly, you're not just picking up on one room. You're picking up on thousands. Expectations, opinions, judgment, projection. That's a lot for any nervous system, especially a sensitive one. I think this sensitivity showed up in Elvis in very human ways. He could be shy. He could be awkward. He could hesitate. He could overthink. Not because he didn't know who he was, but because he felt things deeply. And people who feel deeply tend to process slowly. They don't rush decisions. They replay conversations. They wonder if they upset someone. They care about impact. And that doesn't come from insecurity. It comes from empathy. When someone is sensitive, it doesn't just affect how they feel. It affects how they move through the world. They're often more cautious, more observant, more inward. Not because they're unsure, but because they're processing. And I think Elvis was someone who processed a lot internally. Not everything he felt come out in words. Not everything he carried was visible. And that can make someone appear distant, when in reality they're just deep. People who are like that don't always know how to explain what's going on inside of them. So they stay quiet, and silence often gets misread. We live in a culture that reads confidence as loudness. If you're outspoken, you're seen as strong. If you're reserved, you're seen as uncertain. But that's not how humans, beings, actually work. Some people are loud thinkers. Some people are quiet ones. Elvis strikes me as someone who thought quietly. He didn't need to announce everything he felt. He didn't need to process it out loud. He carried a lot inside. And when someone does that, people often project onto them. They assume, they interpret, they invent stories. Not always because they mean harm, but because silence makes people uncomfortable. Another thing I think people misunderstand is that public presence and private presence are not the same thing. Someone can be magnetic on stage and reserved in real life. Someone can be expressive in performance and thoughtful in conversation. And those things don't cancel each other out. They coexist. And I think Elvis lived in that contrast. Outward charisma, inward depth. And that can confuse people because we like people to be consistent. But humans rarely are. When I look at Elvis through this lens, not as an icon, but as a human, I don't see contradiction. I see complexity. I see someone who felt deeply, who noticed things, who cared about how he came across, who didn't want to hurt people, and who thought about the impact he had. That tells me a lot about his character, not his talent, but his nature. I think a lot of Elvis's humanity was missed because it didn't fit the story people wanted. People wanted the star, the confidence, the swagger, the certainty. They didn't want the sensitivity, the overthinking, the quietness, or the emotional depth. Not because these things were bad, but because they complicated the image. And humans aren't very good with complicated. We like simple, strong or weak, confident or insecure, happy or sad. But humans don't live in those boxes. And Elvis Presley definitely didn't. Sensitivity is often treated like something that needs fixing. But I think it's one of the biggest reasons Elvis connected with people so deeply. Sensitive people notice pain. They notice when someone's uncomfortable. They notice when someone feels small. They notice what goes unsaid. And when you notice those things, you respond differently. You soften, you adapt, you try to make things easier for others. And that's not weakness, that's emotional intelligence. When someone doesn't explain themselves loudly, often other people fill in the gaps. They project, they assume motives, they invent reasons, and they tell stories. Because silence makes people uneasy. And I think that a lot of the stories told about Elvis came from projection, not reality. People mistook his quietness for mystery, him being sensitive for being unstable, his inwardness for distance, when really he was just processing life in his own way. If you look at Elvis as a sensitive person living in a loud, demanding world, a lot starts to make sense. The pressure, the retreating, the searching, the contradictions. Not as flaws, but as human responses. Sensitive people don't cope by becoming harder. They cope by becoming more inward. And that doesn't always look pretty on the outside, but it's very real on the inside. When you understand this part of him, you stop asking, why was he like that? And you start asking, how could he not be like that? It humanises him. It removes judgment. It replaces it with understanding. And I think Elvis Presley deserves that. When we only look at Elvis through the lens of fame, we miss something essential. We miss the person. And when we miss the person, we start telling the wrong stories. We start asking, why wasn't he tougher? Why didn't he just ignore things? Why didn't he harden up? Why did he care so much? But those questions come from a misunderstanding of sensitivity. Sensitive people don't choose to feel deeply. They just do. And learning to understand that changes the entire story. I think one of the hardest things for sensitive people is not the feeling itself. It's the misunderstanding. Being told you're too much, too emotional, too quiet, too complicated, when really you're just aware. And Elvis lived in a world that didn't slow down for awareness. He lived in a world that demanded performance, certainty, and answers. And sensitivity doesn't move at that pace. It pauses, it reflects, it feels. And that can look like hesitation, when it's actually depth. When we understand Elvis this way, the language around him changes. We stop saying he was strange and start saying he was sensitive. We stop saying he was confusing and start saying he was complex. We stop saying he didn't know who he was and start saying he felt deeply, and that takes time to understand. That shift matters because language shapes memory. I think this conversation about Elvis is also a conversation about us, about how we treat sensitive people, how we misunderstand quiet people, about how we project onto those who don't explain themselves loudly. There are so many people watching who probably recognise this in themselves. People who feel deeply, who overthink, who are gentle in a loud world. And maybe this gives you permission to stop seeing this as a flaw. When I look at Elvis through this lens, I don't see weakness. I see someone who noticed life, who felt it, who carried it. And that makes him more human to me, not less. It makes his story richer, not messier. So when people ask me why I care so much about seeing Elvis as a person, this is why. Because behind every story there is a nervous system. Because behind every image there is a heart. Behind every legend there is a human being. And I think remembering that changes everything. If this episode helped you see Elvis a little differently, not as a myth, but as a person, then I'm really glad you're here. And if this kind of space feels like something you enjoy, you're very welcome to stay. You can like, subscribe or share, but only if it feels right, no pressure. So until next time, take care of yourself, take care of each other, and always keep a little Elvis magic in your heart.